Sarah Matthews thought she had buried her past when she burned every letter from Jake Harrison, the military contractor, who disappeared during a classified mission in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Now living a quiet life as a librarian in small-town Montana, she's learned to navigate the pain of losing the only man she ever truly loved. But when Jake suddenly appears at her doorstep, scarred, haunted, and carrying secrets that could destroy them both, Sarah must confront the woman she became in his absence and decide if some loves are worth the risk of losing everything she's built to protect her heart. Tikum! The rain drummed against the windows of the Whitefish Public Library with an intensity that made Sarah Matthews glance up from her computer screen for the third time in 10 minutes. October in Montana always brought these sudden downpours, but tonight's storm felt different, more urgent, more alive. She pushed her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose and returned to cataloging the new mystery novels that had arrived that morning, trying to ignore the way the thunder seemed to echo the rhythm of her restless heart. At 29, Sarah had perfected the art of quiet routine. Wake at 6:30, coffee with exactly 2 sugars, drive the same route to work, organize books that other people would lose themselves in, while she remained safely anchored to reality. It was a life she had constructed deliberately, brick by careful brick, after learning that some kinds of love could tear a person apart so completely that the only choice was to rebuild from scratch. The library's old heating system groaned to life, filling the silence with its familiar mechanical wheeze. Sarah had always found comfort in the building's quirks, the way the 3rd floorboard from the reference section creaked, how the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows and painted golden rectangles across the worn carpet. This place had become her sanctuary, a fortress of predictable days and manageable emotions. She was reaching for the next book in the stack when the lights flickered, once, twice, then died completely, plunging the library into the gray twilight of the storm. Sarah's hand froze mid-air, her pulse quickening in that instinctive way that reminded her she was still capable of feeling afraid, even if she'd spent 3 years convincing herself otherwise. The emergency generator kicked in after a few seconds, bathing everything in the harsh glow of fluorescent backup lighting. Sarah exhaled slowly and reached for her phone to check the time, 6:47 p.m. She should have left 17 minutes ago, but Mrs. Henderson's book club had needed help finding copies of their next selection. And then the Murphy twins had knocked over an entire display of children's books. Tuesday evenings were supposed to be predictable. She gathered her things with practiced efficiency. Keys, purse, the umbrella she'd started carrying religiously after moving to Montana. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and her small Honda Civic would need every bit of traction to make it up the hill to her cottage. Sarah had chosen to live outside town, partly for the privacy, but mostly because something about being surrounded by mountains and trees made her feel less exposed, less visible to the world that had already taken too much from her. The drive home should have taken 12 minutes. Sarah knew because she'd timed it obsessively during her first weeks in Whitefish, when every routine felt like a lifeline and every minute accounted for was another minute she didn't have to think about Jake Harrison's hands in her hair or the way he used to read over her shoulder while she graded papers in their shared apartment in Denver. Tonight, the trip took 18 minutes because of the storm, and by the time she pulled into her gravel driveway, Sarah's knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel. The cottage looked exactly as she'd left it that morning. Blue shutters that needed painting, the herb garden she'd never quite learned to maintain, the wooden porch swing that she'd bought impulsively and never sat on because it reminded her too much of the one at her childhood home in Nebraska, where her parents still lived and worried about their daughter who'd moved so far away to heal from things she'd never fully explained. Sarah darted through the rain to her front door, fumbling with keys that seemed determined to slip from her wet fingers. Once inside, she flipped the light switch and felt that familiar surge of relief when the electricity proved it was still working. The cottage was small. Living room, kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had sold her on the place. But it was hers, and after 3 years, it finally felt like home instead of just a place where she slept. She was hanging her jacket on the hook by the door when she saw it, a manila envelope, thick and substantial, lying on her coffee table. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She hadn't put it there. No one had a key to her cottage except Mrs. Kowalski, her elderly neighbor, who occasionally checked on the place when Sarah traveled to visit her parents, and Mrs. Kowalski would never let herself in without calling first. Sarah's breath came shorter as she approached the envelope. Her name was written across the front in black ink, the handwriting careful and precise, in a way that made her stomach clench with recognition she refused to acknowledge. With hands that trembled slightly, she picked it up and felt the weight of what had to be dozens of pages inside. There was no return address, no postmark, nothing to indicate how it had arrived or who had delivered it. Sarah sank onto her couch, the envelope heavy in her lap, and tried to steady her breathing. She'd learned techniques for this during the dark months after Jake's disappearance. Square breathing, grounding exercises, ways to pull herself back from the edge of panic that always lurked just beneath her carefully maintained composure. She opened the envelope. The first thing she saw made her gasp out loud. Her own handwriting, younger and more carelessly optimistic, sprawled across cream-colored stationery she recognized from the set Jake had bought her for her 24th birthday. The letter on top was dated 4 years ago, when she still believed that love was enough to survive anything and that Jake's deployment to Afghanistan was just another obstacle they would overcome together. "My dearest Jake," the letter began. "I know you said not to write too much because it makes the missing worse, but I can't help myself. Today I saw the most beautiful sunset over the Rockies, and I thought about how you always said Colorado sunsets were God's way of apologizing for winter." Sarah's vision blurred. These were her letters to Jake, dozens of them, written during his 8-month deployment before the mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Letters she'd poured her heart into, writing about her teaching job, their plans for the future, the small daily moments she'd wanted to share with him across thousands of miles. Letters he'd carried with him into that classified operation that had ended with his team declared missing, presumed dead, and Sarah's world imploding into grief so complete she'd thought she might die from it. She'd kept copies of every letter, stored in a wooden box under her bed in the Denver apartment they'd shared. When the official notification came, when that stone-faced officer had stood in her doorway and explained that Jake's team had been lost in a region too dangerous for recovery operations, Sarah had taken that box to her parents' backyard and burned every page. She'd watched 4 years of love and hope and dreams turn to ash because holding on to them was killing her, and she'd needed to survive. But here they were, returned to her like ghosts made of paper and ink. With shaking hands, Sarah flipped through the stack. Every letter she'd written in chronological order, preserved and protected in a way that suggested someone had treasured them. At the bottom of the envelope was a single sheet of different paper, heavier stock, with a message written in that same careful handwriting that was definitely not hers. "Sarah, I carried these with me through everything. They kept me alive when nothing else could. I'm sorry it took so long to bring them home. I'm sorry for all of it. But I'm alive, and I'm here, and I need you to know that every word you wrote was true." Sarah's hands began to shake so violently that she nearly dropped the letters. Jake Harrison, who had been declared dead 3 years ago, who had been buried in her heart alongside every dream they'd shared, who had supposedly died in the mountains of Afghanistan in a mission gone wrong. Jake, whose body had never been recovered because the region was too hostile for search operations. Jake, who had somehow returned her letters to her on a Tuesday night in October while she was working late at the library. The cottage felt suddenly too small, too quiet, except for the sound of her own ragged breathing and the rain that continued to pound against the windows. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and walked to the kitchen, then the bedroom, checking every corner as if expecting to find him hiding in the shadows. But the cottage was empty, exactly as it had been when she'd left that morning, except for the envelope full of impossible things sitting on her coffee table. She returned to the living room and read Jake's note again, and then a third time, as if repetition might make it make sense. The handwriting was definitely his. She'd memorized every curve and angle during the months when letters were their only connection. But Jake Harrison was dead. She'd seen the official reports, attended the memorial service, spent 2 years in therapy learning to accept that some losses were permanent and final, Sarah sank back onto the couch and picked up the first letter again, reading her own words from 4 years ago when she'd still believed that love could conquer geography and danger and time. The girl who had written these letters felt like a stranger now, so trusting, so certain that their story would have a happy ending. That girl had planned a wedding and imagined children, and believed that Jake would come home to build the life they'd dreamed about during late-night phone calls and stolen weekend visits. The rain intensified, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains with a sound like artillery fire. Sarah flinched at the association, another gift from her years of loving a man who'd carried weapons into war zones and come home with shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before. She was still sitting there an hour later, the letters spread across her coffee table like evidence of a crime, when she heard footsteps on her porch. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this story. Your connection to these moments means everything. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and measured, followed by the sound of someone stopping directly in front of her door. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the wooden barrier that suddenly felt as substantial as paper. For 3 years, she'd lived in this cottage without fear, but now every instinct screamed danger, even as her mind struggled to process what that danger might be. The footsteps moved again, not away, but around to the side of the cottage, toward the window that looked out over her small kitchen. Sarah forced herself to breathe as she heard the soft sound of boots on wet gravel, circling her home like a predator testing the perimeter. Then silence. Sarah waited, every muscle tensed, for the sound to return. Minutes passed with nothing but rain and wind and the thundering of her own pulse in her ears. Slowly, carefully, she stood and walked to the front window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The porch was empty. The driveway showed only her own car and the rain-soaked gravel. If someone had been there, they were gone now, leaving behind only the echo of footsteps and the terrible certainty that her carefully constructed sanctuary was no longer safe. Sarah let the curtain fall and turned back to the letters scattered on her coffee table. Jake's note lay on top, the words, "I'm alive and I'm here," seeming to pulse with their own light in the lamp glow. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent learning to live with his absence, the careful walls she'd built around her heart, the quiet life she'd chosen because it was the opposite of everything they'd been together. And she thought about footsteps in the rain and the way her name had looked written in his hand. Outside, the storm showed no signs of ending, and Sarah Matthews sat alone in her cottage, surrounded by the ghosts of letters she'd thought she'd burned, and the growing certainty that her past was not nearly as buried as she'd believed. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat curled in the corner of her couch, a baseball bat across her knees, the same Louisville Slugger her father had insisted she take when she moved to Montana, watching the windows and listening to every sound the old cottage made as it settled around her. The letters remained spread across her coffee table like a puzzle she couldn't solve. Jake's handwriting a constant reminder that everything she'd believed about her life for the past 3 years might be a lie. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind the crisp, washed clean air that always followed Montana's autumn rains. Sarah made coffee with shaking hands and called in sick to work, something she'd done exactly twice in 3 years. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, accepted her excuse of a migraine without question, but Sarah could hear the concern in her voice. In a town like Whitefish, people noticed when you deviated from routine, and Sarah had built her reputation on being utterly reliable. She spent the morning pacing her cottage, checking and rechecking the locks, pulling the letters out and putting them away again, as if changing their location might change what they meant. Each time she read Jake's note, the words seemed to rearrange themselves into new impossibilities. "I'm alive and I'm here. Present tense, current, real." At 10:30, she made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. Sarah drove into town and parked outside Miller's Hardware, where old Pete Miller had been selling everything from fishing tackle to fence posts for 40 years. If someone had been watching her cottage, If someone had been asking questions about the woman who lived alone up Birch Hill Road, Pete would know about it. In Whitefish, information flowed through Miller's hardware the way water flowed through mountain streams, inevitably and with surprising force. The bell above the door chimed as Sarah entered, and Pete looked up from behind the counter, where he was organizing a display of hunting knives. He was 73 years old, built like a tree stump, and had the kind of memory that could recall every customer who'd bought a particular type of screw in the past decade. "Sarah Matthews," he said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Don't usually see you on a Wednesday morning. Playing hooky?" Something like that. Sarah approached the counter, trying to appear casual. "Pete, I was wondering, has anyone been asking about me lately? New people in town maybe asking questions about who lives where." Pete's expression shifted, becoming more alert. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, questions about privacy meant trouble. "Why? Someone bothering you up at that cottage?" "I'm not sure," Sarah said carefully. I had the feeling someone might have been around yesterday evening. Probably nothing, but you know how it is." Pete nodded slowly. "In Montana, you trusted your instincts about things like that, especially if you were a woman living alone. Can't say anyone's been asking about you specifically, but..." He paused, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "Funny thing, though. Had a fellow in here Monday, buying supplies. Cash only, no credit card. Nothing unusual about that except he wasn't local and he wasn't a tourist either." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of supplies?" "Basic camping gear, but military surplus stuff. The kind of equipment someone would want if they were planning to stay off-grid for a while. Asked about property rentals too. Specifically wanted something remote." Pete's eyes sharpened. Big guy. Looked like he'd seen some action overseas. Had that way about him, you know. The way soldiers carry themselves. The description hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jake had been 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a kind of controlled stillness that came from years of military training. Even in civilian clothes, he'd moved like someone who was constantly scanning for threats, assessing exits, calculating distances. "Did he say what his name was?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Called himself Jack Hudson, but the thing is..." Pete leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've been selling gear to military folks for 30 years, and there's something about the way they handle equipment. This guy, he knew exactly what he was looking for. Grabbed the right sizes without trying anything on. Asked specific questions about durability and temperature ratings. Professional knowledge, you understand?" Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Did he say how long he was planning to stay in the area?" "Indefinite," he said. Mentioned something about unfinished business. Pete studied Sarah's face carefully. "You want me to call Sheriff Morrison? If someone's making you uncomfortable..." "No," Sarah said quickly. "No, it's probably nothing. I've been jumpy lately." But Pete wasn't finished. "One more thing that struck me odd. When he was leaving, he asked about the library. Wanted to know what days it was open, what the hours were. Said he was interested in local history. But something about the way he asked..." Pete shrugged. "Like I said, probably nothing, but in a town this size, you notice things." Sarah managed to thank Pete and make her escape, but her hands were shaking so badly she had trouble starting her car. Jack Hudson, J.H. Jake Harrison. It wasn't exactly subtle, but then again, Jake had never been subtle about anything except the work that had eventually taken him away from her. She drove home on autopilot, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same impossible conclusion. Jake was alive. Jake was in Whitefish. Jake had been in her cottage, had left those letters, and was now camping somewhere in the surrounding wilderness, watching her from a distance like some kind of ghost made flesh. Back at the cottage, Sarah pulled out her laptop and did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She searched for information about Jake's mission. She'd avoided details during the immediate aftermath of his disappearance, partly because the information was classified and partly because knowing how he died wouldn't bring him back. But now she needed answers, even if they came 3 years too late. The official reports were still classified, but news articles from the time painted a picture of a mission gone catastrophically wrong. Jake's unit, a small team of military contractors working with special operations, had been providing security for a humanitarian operation in a remote region of Afghanistan when they'd come under attack. The articles were vague about details, but they all agreed on the basic facts. The team had been overrun, communications lost, and the area too hostile for immediate recovery operations. What she found in the deeper searches made her blood run cold. There had been rumors, unconfirmed reports from other military personnel, suggesting that not all of the team had been killed in the initial attack. Some might have been captured, taken to regions where American forces couldn't operate, held in conditions that made survival unlikely but not impossible. The Pentagon had officially denied these reports, but family members had continued to press for information, hire private investigators, demand answers that never came. Sarah closed the laptop and stared at the wall where she'd hung a painting of mountain wildflowers, something cheerful and peaceful to replace the photographs of her old life that she'd packed away. If Jake had been captured instead of killed, if he'd spent 3 years as a prisoner in some remote location, if he'd somehow managed to escape or been released, the thought was almost too large to hold in her mind. 3 years of believing he was dead, 3 years of grieving and healing and building a new life, and he'd been alive the entire time, suffering probably, surviving whatever hell his captors had put him through, while she'd been learning to sleep without nightmares and date other men and convince herself that she could be happy without him. She thought about David Chen, the high school English teacher who'd asked her to dinner 6 months ago and whom she'd been seeing in the careful, measured way of two people who'd both been hurt before. David was kind and stable and completely unlike Jake in every way that mattered, which was exactly why she'd said yes when he'd asked her out. David represented the future she'd chosen, the safe and predictable life she'd built to protect herself from ever being destroyed by love again. What comes next is even stronger, and to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free, and you'll be with me in every new story. At 3 p.m, her phone rang. Sarah nearly jumped out of her skin, but the caller ID showed David's name, and she answered on the 4th ring. "Hey," his voice was warm and familiar. "I heard you called in sick today. Are you feeling okay?" Sarah closed her eyes. David was a good man who brought her flowers and held doors, and never pushed her to talk about the parts of her past that were too painful to share. He deserved better than whatever emotional chaos she was about to drag him into. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just a headache. I'll probably be back to work tomorrow." "Good to hear. Listen, I was wondering if you wanted to grab dinner Friday night. That new place in Kalispell got a great review in the paper, and I thought—" David paused. "Sarah, are you sure you're okay? You sound strange." "I'm fine," she repeated, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. How could she explain that her dead boyfriend had apparently returned from the grave and was camping in the woods outside her cottage? How could she tell David that every assumption she'd made about her life for the past 3 years had been turned upside down by an envelope full of letters? "Maybe we should postpone dinner," she said instead. "I think I might be coming down with something more serious than just a headache." There was a pause on the other end of the line. David was perceptive. It was one of the things she liked about him, and he could hear the distress in her voice even when she tried to hide it. "Sarah, if something's wrong, you can talk to me. You know that, right?" The kindness in his voice almost broke her. David represented everything she thought she wanted: stability, predictability, a love that didn't tear her apart from the inside. But sitting in her cottage with Jake's letters spread across her coffee table, she realized that what she'd built with David wasn't love at all. It was safety. It was the emotional equivalent of hiding under the covers and hoping the monsters couldn't find you. "I know," she said softly. I need some time to think about things." After she hung up, Sarah sat in the growing afternoon shadows and tried to imagine what she would say to Jake if he walked through her door. 3 years of anger and grief and carefully reconstructed life couldn't just be erased by his return. She'd mourned him, buried him in her heart, moved across 3 states to escape the memories they'd made together. She'd learned to live without him, and that learning had cost her everything she'd thought she was. The woman who had loved Jake Harrison had been fearless and impulsive and willing to risk everything for the chance at a great love story. The woman sitting in this cottage was careful and controlled and terrified of letting anyone get close enough to hurt her again. If Jake really was alive, if he really was here, which version of herself was she supposed to be? As evening approached, Sarah found herself standing at her kitchen window, looking out at the tree line where the forest began. Somewhere out there, if Pete Miller was right, Jake was watching and waiting. The Jake she'd known had been patient when it mattered, capable of waiting hours for the right moment to act. If he'd survived 3 years of captivity, if he'd made it home only to find that she'd disappeared, he would take his time figuring out how to approach her. But patience had limits, even for someone like Jake Harrison. Sarah was making herself a sandwich she didn't want when she heard it, the soft chime of her phone receiving a text message. She looked at the screen and felt the world tilt around her. Unknown number. I know this is impossible to understand. I know you think I'm dead, but I need to see you, Sarah. I need you to know I never stopped coming home to you. Her hands shook as she typed back. If you're really Jake, prove it. The response came immediately. You have a scar on your left shoulder blade from when you fell off your bike trying to impress me during our second date. You were wearing that blue dress that made your eyes look like stars. You cried afterward not because you were hurt, but because you were embarrassed. Sarah's knees buckled and she grabbed the kitchen counter for support. No one else knew about that scar, about that night, about the way Jake had cleaned her scrapes and kissed her forehead and told her she was the most beautiful disaster he'd ever seen. When? She texted back. Tonight? Midnight. The old bridge over Clearwater Creek. Come alone. Sarah stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone down with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. In 6 hours, she would either be reunited with the love of her life or walking into a trap set by someone who knew too much about her past. Either way, the careful, safe life she'd built in Whitefish was about to end. Outside her window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the sunsets Jake used to love. And somewhere in the growing darkness, the past was waiting to reclaim her. Sarah spent the hours before midnight moving through her cottage like a sleepwalker, picking up objects and setting them down without purpose, checking the clock every few minutes as if time might somehow move differently under the weight of her anxiety. She changed clothes 3 times, first into jeans and a sweater, then a dress that felt too formal for a clandestine meeting in the woods, finally settling on dark jeans and Jake's old military jacket that she'd somehow never been able to donate to charity. The jacket still smelled faintly of his cologne, even after 3 years hanging in the back of her closet. Sarah had discovered this by accident 6 months ago while looking for winter coats, and the scent had sent her into a panic attack that lasted 20 minutes. Now she wore it like armor, hoping it might remind her of who she used to be before grief had reshaped her into someone smaller and more afraid. At 11:30, she grabbed her keys and the small canister of pepper spray her father had given her, then hesitated at the door. If this really was Jake, if he was truly alive and waiting for her at the bridge, what would she say to him? How do you greet someone who died in your heart 3 years ago? How do you explain that you'd moved on, that you'd tried to fall in love with someone else, that you'd spent years in therapy learning to accept his loss? And if it wasn't Jake, if this was some elaborate trap or cruel joke, then she was walking into danger with nothing but pepper spray and the desperate hope that her instincts weren't completely wrong. Sarah locked the cottage behind her and drove toward town, with her headlights cutting through the mountain darkness. The road to Clearwater Creek wound through forest so dense that the trees seemed to press against her windows, and more than once, she caught herself checking the rear-view mirror for headlights that never appeared. The radio played soft country music that she barely heard over the sound of her own heartbeat. The old bridge was a remnant from Whitefish's logging days, a wooden structure that crossed the creek about 2 miles outside town, officially closed to vehicle traffic, but still used by hikers and fishermen. Sarah had discovered it during her first summer in Montana, drawn by the way moonlight looked on water and the peace that came from being completely alone. It was the kind of place Jake would choose for a meeting like this, isolated, defensible, with multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest. She parked at the trailhead and walked the quarter-mile path to the bridge, her flashlight beam dancing ahead of her on the worn dirt trail. The creek gurgled quietly below, and somewhere in the distance an owl called through the darkness. Sarah's boots made soft, crunching sounds on the fallen leaves, and she found herself moving more quietly, some instinct telling her to minimize her presence in this place where secrets were about to be revealed. The bridge appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, weathered wood and old iron, spanning dark water that reflected the star-filled sky. Sarah stopped at the edge and checked her phone. 11:58. She was early, which meant she had time to think, time to second-guess every decision that had brought her to this moment. She was still staring at her phone when she heard footsteps behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering, and saw a figure emerging from the tree line. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled stillness she remembered from 1,000 dreams and nightmares. The man stopped about 10 feet away, just at the edge of her flashlight beam, and Sarah felt the world rearrange itself around his presence. "Hello, Sarah." His voice was different, rougher, like he'd spent years not using it much, but unmistakably Jake's. The same deep rumble that used to whisper her name in the dark, that used to call her from across crowded rooms, that used to read her bedtime stories when she couldn't sleep. Sarah's flashlight wavered in her grip, and she had to consciously remind herself to breathe. "You're dead," she whispered, the words feeling absurd even as she spoke them. Jake stepped forward and the light caught his face. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. It was him, the same dark eyes, the same strong jaw, the same mouth that had kissed her goodbye at Denver International Airport 3.5 years ago. But he was different too, thinner, harder, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and a scar running from his left temple to his cheek. His hair was longer than he'd ever worn it, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a wariness, a weight, as if he'd seen things that had changed the fundamental architecture of who he was. "I know," he said quietly. "I know that's what you were told. It's what everyone was told." Sarah's legs felt unsteady, and she gripped the bridge railing for support. "The Pentagon said, they said your team was killed. They said there were no survivors. There weren't supposed to be." Jake moved closer, close enough that she could see the way his hands shook slightly, as if this moment was costing him as much as it was costing her. "Sarah, I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is classified at levels that could get both of us killed just for talking about it." "I don't care about classified," Sarah said, anger suddenly flaring through her shock. "I don't care about your missions or your secrets or whatever game this is. Do you have any idea what the last 3 years have been like? Do you have any idea what it did to me when they said you were dead?" Jake's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the man she'd fallen in love with, vulnerable and human and desperately sorry. "I know. God, Sarah, I know. And I'm so sorry. If there had been any other way to do what? To let me think you were dead? To disappear without a word?" Sarah's voice was rising. 3 years of suppressed grief and rage finally finding its voice. "I mourned you, Jake. I fell apart completely. I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch because losing you nearly killed me. I couldn't contact you," Jake said urgently. "I couldn't let anyone know I was alive, not even you, especially not you." "Why?" The word came out as a broken sob. "Why couldn't you tell me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets too heavy for one person to bear. "Because the mission that got my team killed wasn't what we thought it was. We weren't providing security for a humanitarian operation. We were bait. Someone wanted us in that location at that specific time, and they were willing to sacrifice all of us to make it happen." Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. Bait for what? For information about a weapons smuggling operation that went all the way up to Pentagon leadership. My team wasn't supposed to survive, because dead men can't testify about what they've seen. Jake's hands clenched into fists. "But I did survive. Barely. I was captured, held in a compound in the mountains for 8 months while the people who betrayed us tried to figure out what I knew and who I might have told." The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that made Sarah's stomach clench with horror. "They tortured you. They tried to." Jake's voice was matter of fact, but Sarah could see the cost of those memories in his eyes. "Eventually, I was able to escape, but by then, I'd learned enough about the operation to know that going public would be signing both our death warrants. The people behind this have resources, Sarah. They have connections at every level of government and military. If they'd known I was alive and that you were still in the picture, they would have used me to get to you," Sarah finished quietly, "or killed you to send a message." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of his skin beneath the unfamiliar odors of campfire smoke and wilderness living. "I've spent the last 2 years working with a small group of people, other survivors, whistleblowers, journalists, to build a case that might actually stick. We're close, Sarah. Close enough that I thought it might be safe to come home." Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks, though she didn't remember starting to cry. The magnitude of what he was telling her, the scope of betrayal and danger and loss, was almost too large to comprehend. But underneath it all was a simpler truth that cut through everything else like a knife. Jake was alive, and he'd stayed away to protect her. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free, and it helps me keep sharing. "You should have told me," she whispered. "You should have found a way to let me know you were alive." "I wanted to," Jake said, and his voice broke on the words. "Every single day, I wanted to call you, to write to you, to find some way to let you know that I was fighting to come home. But the risk was too great, and I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of me." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man she'd loved wearing the face of a stranger. The Jake who had left her had been confident and optimistic, someone who believed that good people could make a difference in the world. This Jake carried shadows that went bone deep, the kind that came from learning that the system you'd sworn to serve was capable of betraying you in the most fundamental ways. "I moved on," she said quietly. "I had to. I'm seeing someone else now." Jake nodded as if he'd expected this, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. "I know. I've been watching you for 3 days, trying to figure out how to approach you. I saw him drop you off at the library yesterday." "David," Sarah said. "His name is David, and he's a good man." "I'm sure he is." Jake's voice was carefully neutral. "Do you love him?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah found herself unable to answer immediately. 6 months ago, she would have said she was learning to love David, that she was building something healthy and stable with him. But standing here in the darkness with Jake alive and real in front of her, she realized that what she felt for David was affection and gratitude and the desperate desire for normalcy, not love. Not the kind of love that had nearly destroyed her when she'd lost it. "I don't know," she said finally. "I thought I might be able to, eventually." Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the same eyes that had watched her sleep in their shared bed in Denver. "Sarah, I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that my being alive doesn't erase the last 3 years or give us back what we lost. But I need you to know that you're the reason I survived everything they did to me. Every day, every hour, I held on to the memory of loving you and the hope that someday I might be able to come home." Sarah felt something breaking open in her chest, something she'd sealed away so carefully that she'd forgotten it was there. "Jake, I'm not asking you to forget about your life here," he said quickly. "I'm not asking you to give up everything you've built, but I need you to know that I'm still in love with you. I never stopped being in love with you. And if there's any part of you that might be able to forgive me for staying away, if there's any chance that what we had might still be worth fighting for." Before Sarah could answer, before she could process the magnitude of what he was asking, Jake pulled something from his jacket pocket, a small velvet box, worn and battered as if it had traveled a very long way. "I was carrying this when our convoy was attacked," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple diamond ring that caught the starlight and threw it back in tiny fragments of fire. "I was going to propose to you when I got home from that deployment. I was going to ask you to marry me and spend the rest of our lives together." Sarah stared at the ring, and suddenly she was 25 again, lying in Jake's arms in their Denver apartment, talking about the future they would build together when he finished his military service. They'd planned everything: the wedding, the house they would buy, the children they would have, the quiet life they would build far away from the danger and uncertainty of his work. 3.5 years ago, Jake continued, "I was going to tell you that I loved you more than anything in the world, and that I wanted to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. That's still true, Sarah. After everything that's happened, after all the time that's passed, that's still the truest thing I know." Sarah looked up from the ring to find Jake watching her with an expression of desperate hope mixed with terror, as if her answer might determine not just their future, but his ability to keep breathing. And in that moment, she realized that the careful, safe life she'd built in Whitefish, the cottage, the job, the relationship with David, had been built on the foundation of Jake's absence, with him standing in front of her, offering her everything she'd thought she'd lost forever. The walls she'd constructed around her heart began to crumble. But 3 years of grief and healing couldn't be undone in a single conversation, no matter how much love still existed between them. Sarah took a step back, needing space to think, to breathe, to figure out how to reconcile the woman she'd become with the woman she'd been. "I need time," she said finally. "I need time to process all of this, to figure out what it means." Jake nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. "How much time?" Sarah looked at the ring, at Jake's face, at the bridge where they stood surrounded by the Montana wilderness that had become her sanctuary. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to return to the life she'd built or step back into the love story she thought was over. She would have to choose between safety and passion, between David's steady affection and Jake's devastating love, between the woman she'd become and the woman she'd been. "I don't know," she whispered. "I honestly don't know." Sarah didn't go home after leaving Jake at the bridge. Instead, she drove aimlessly through the Montana darkness, taking back roads that wound through forest and farmland, while her mind struggled to process everything that had happened. The engagement ring sat in its velvet box on her passenger seat. Jake had insisted she take it, not as a commitment, but as proof that his love for her had survived everything he'd endured. She found herself at Flathead Lake just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the water in shades of pink and gold that reminded her of mornings in Denver when she and Jake would watch the sunrise from their apartment balcony. Those had been simple times, when the biggest worry was whether Jake would get called away for another deployment and how long they'd be apart this time. Neither of them had imagined that separation could last 3 years or that reunion could feel more terrifying than loss. Sarah sat on a fallen log at the water's edge and called in sick to work again, knowing that Mrs. Patterson would start asking serious questions if this became a pattern. But the thought of cataloging books and helping patrons find romance novels felt absurd when her own love story had just been resurrected from the dead. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Hope you're feeling better today. Don't push yourself to come back too soon." The kindness in his message made her chest ache with guilt. David deserved honesty, but how could she explain that her supposedly dead boyfriend had returned with classified secrets and an engagement ring? How could she tell him that everything she thought she'd known about herself for the past 3 years had been turned upside down in a single midnight conversation? She was still staring at David's message when her phone rang. For a wild moment, she thought it might be Jake, but the caller ID showed her sister Emma's name, and Sarah felt a familiar mix of love and dread. Emma called every Wednesday morning like clockwork, checking in on her older sister who'd moved so far away after that terrible tragedy with the military boyfriend. "Hey, Em," Sarah answered, trying to inject some normalcy into her voice. "You sound awful," Emma said immediately. Emma was 2 years younger, but had always possessed an uncanny ability to read Sarah's emotional state through tiny vocal cues. "Are you getting sick? It's that time of year when everyone starts catching flu." "Something like that," Sarah said, which wasn't entirely a lie. Learning that the love of your life had been alive all along definitely felt like coming down with something serious. "Well, take care of yourself. You know how you get when you're run down. You start overthinking everything and making yourself miserable." Emma paused. "How are things with David? Mom keeps asking if she should start shopping for Mother of the Bride outfits." Sarah closed her eyes. Their mother had been thrilled when Sarah started dating David, not because she particularly cared about him as a person, but because he represented stability and the possibility that Sarah might finally settle down and stop running away from happiness. The irony was that Sarah had thought she was running toward happiness, or at least toward a version of it that wouldn't destroy her if it disappeared. "David's fine. Sarah said carefully. "We're taking things slow. Too slow if you ask me. You've been dating for 6 months, and you still won't even introduce him to the family. At some point, you have to stop protecting yourself and actually live a little." The words hit harder than Emma could have intended. Sarah had spent 3 years learning to live smaller, to want less, to protect herself from the kind of love that could leave her shattered on a bathroom floor, sobbing until she couldn't breathe. But maybe Emma was right. Maybe what she'd built with David wasn't life at all. It was just existence, carefully managed and emotionally controlled. Can I ask you something?" Sarah found herself saying. "If someone you loved came back from the dead, if they'd been gone for years and you'd moved on, would you?" "What kind of question is that?" Emma's voice sharpened with concern. "Sarah, are you having those dreams again? Because Dr. Martinez said that grief can resurface at any time, especially around anniversaries or—" "I'm fine," Sarah said quickly. "It was just a hypothetical. I was reading this book and it got me thinking about second chances." But Emma wasn't buying it. "You don't sound fine. You sound like you did right after Jake died, when you wouldn't eat or sleep or talk to anyone. Please tell me you're not spiraling again." The concern in her sister's voice was genuine and loving, but it also reminded Sarah of how completely she'd fallen apart after Jake's supposed death. Emma had flown to Denver to help pack up the apartment, had held Sarah's hair back while she threw up from anxiety medication, had been there for the worst moments when grief had felt like a physical illness that might actually kill her. "I'm not spiraling," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I'm just processing some things." After she hung up, Sarah sat by the lake until the sun was fully up and the morning joggers started appearing on the trail. Then she drove back to Whitefish and did something she'd been avoiding for 3 years. She went to see Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the therapist who'd helped her put her life back together after Jake's disappearance. Dr. Hayes practiced out of a small office above the town's only bookstore, and she'd been the one to suggest that Sarah might benefit from working at the library, surrounded by other people's stories instead of drowning in her own. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of unflappable demeanor that came from years of helping people navigate their worst moments. "Sarah," Dr. Hayes said when she opened her office door, clearly surprised. "I wasn't expecting to see you. Is everything all right?" "I need to talk to someone," Sarah said simply, "and I think you're the only person who might understand." They settled into the familiar chairs where Sarah had spent so many hours learning to accept Jake's death and rebuild her sense of self. The office looked exactly the same: books on psychology and healing, a box of tissues on the coffee table, the abstract painting that Sarah had stared at during particularly difficult sessions. "What's happened?" Dr. Hayes asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that felt like jumping off another cliff. "Jake isn't dead. He's alive and he's here, and I don't know what to do with that information." To her credit, Dr. Hayes didn't immediately suggest that Sarah was having a psychotic break. Instead, she leaned forward slightly and said, "Tell me what happened." So Sarah did. She told her about the letters appearing in her cottage, about the text messages and the meeting at the bridge, about Jake's story of capture and betrayal, and the years he'd spent working to expose the conspiracy that had nearly killed him. She told her about the engagement ring and the way her carefully constructed life suddenly felt like a house of cards in a strong wind. Dr. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, but mostly just giving Sarah the space to process everything out loud. When Sarah finished, they sat in silence for several minutes, while Dr. Hayes absorbed the magnitude of what she'd heard. "How do you feel about all of this?" Dr. Hayes finally asked. "Terrified," Sarah said immediately. "Angry, confused, relieved." Heartbroken all over again, but differently this time. She paused, searching for the right words. "I spent 3 years learning to live without him. I became a different person, someone who doesn't take risks, who doesn't trust that good things will last. And now he's back, and he's asking me to be the person I was before. But I don't know if that person still exists. Do you want her to exist?" The question caught Sarah off guard. "I don't know." She was fearless and impulsive and completely willing to bet everything on love. She was also naive and unprepared for how much it could hurt when things went wrong. "And the person you are now?" "Safe," Sarah said. "Careful, emotionally protected, but also She struggled to find the words. Also half alive, maybe. Like I've been holding my breath for 3 years, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Sarah, grief changes us. There's no going back to exactly who we were before a major loss. That's not how healing works. But that doesn't mean the person you've become is necessarily better or worse than who you were before. It means you have more tools, more awareness of your own resilience. But what if I can't love him the way I used to? What if 3 years of believing he was dead changed something fundamental in me? Then you'll love him differently, Dr. Hayes said simply. Love isn't static, Sarah. It evolves as we do. The question isn't whether you can love Jake the same way you did before. It's whether you can love him as the person you are now, and whether he can love the person you've become. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. And David? What about David? I've been trying to convince myself that what I feel for him could be enough. That safe love, predictable love, might be better than the kind that nearly destroyed me. Dr. Hayes smiled sadly. There's nothing wrong with safe love, Sarah, but there's a difference between choosing safety because it's what you truly want and choosing it because you're afraid of the alternative. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this story. After leaving Dr. Hayes' office, Sarah drove to the high school where David taught English to juniors and seniors who probably thought they were too cool for Shakespeare and Steinbeck. She found him in his classroom during his planning period, grading essays with the kind of focused attention that had first attracted her to him. David was steady in a way that Jake had never been, present and available and emotionally consistent. Sarah, he said, looking up with a smile that faltered when he saw her expression. You look like you've been hit by a truck. Are you sure you shouldn't be home resting? We need to talk, Sarah said, and David's face immediately grew serious. In the 6 months they'd been dating, Sarah had never used those 4 words, and they both knew what they usually meant. David set down his red pen and gave her his full attention. Okay? Sarah sat in one of the student desks, feeling awkward and uncertain. How do you tell someone who's been nothing but good to you that your dead boyfriend has returned and everything is about to change? David, when we started dating, you asked me about my past relationships, and I told you there had been someone serious who died. Do you remember? Of course, David said quietly. You said it was too painful to talk about, and I respected that. His name was Jake, and I thought he was dead for 3 years. But he's not dead, David. He's alive, and he's here. And everything I thought I knew about my life has just been turned upside down. David stared at her for a long moment, processing what she'd said. He's alive? It's complicated, Sarah said, then tried to explain as much as she could without revealing the classified details that Jake had trusted her with. She told David about the military operation gone wrong, about Jake being held captive, about his recent escape and return. When she finished, David was quiet for several minutes, his teacher's mind clearly working through the implications of what she'd told him. Do you still love him? He asked finally. The question was so direct, so honest, that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she'd been drawn to David. His complete lack of game playing, his willingness to address difficult topics head on. I don't know, she said truthfully. I thought I'd moved on, but seeing him again, it's brought up feelings I thought I'd buried. David nodded slowly. And us? What does this mean for us? Sarah felt her heart break a little. David deserved so much better than this conversation, so much better than being the safe choice someone settled for after their great love story imploded. I think, she said carefully, that I need to figure out who I am and what I want before I can be fair to anyone else. And that's not fair to you, David. You deserve someone who's completely present, someone who's not carrying around the ghost of another relationship. Even if that ghost has suddenly become flesh and blood again? Sarah managed a small smile, especially then. David stood and came around his desk, then pulled her into a hug that was gentle and sad and full of understanding. I care about you, Sarah. I want you to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me. I care about you too, Sarah whispered against his shoulder. More than you know. They held each other for a few minutes in the empty classroom, surrounded by motivational posters and student artwork, and Sarah felt the ending of something that had never quite begun. David was a good man, who would find someone who could love him with their whole heart, someone who wasn't fractured by loss and complicated by resurrection. When Sarah left the high school, she felt both guilty and relieved. The conversation with David had been painful but necessary, clearing the deck for whatever came next. She drove home to her cottage as afternoon faded into evening, knowing that Jake would be somewhere in the woods waiting for her answer. But first, she had one more call to make. Sarah sat in her kitchen and dialed her parents' number in Nebraska, steeling herself for a conversation that would change everything they thought they knew about her life in Montana. "Mom," she said when her mother answered, "I need to tell you something, and you're going to want to sit down." Sarah's mother listened in stunned silence as Sarah explained everything, from Jake's letters appearing in her cottage to their meeting at the bridge. When Sarah finished, the phone was quiet for so long that she wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, are you still there?" "I'm here," her mother said finally, her voice shaky. "Sarah, honey, are you absolutely certain it was really him? Not someone pretending to be him or—" She trailed off, unable to voice the possibility that her daughter might be having some kind of breakdown. "It was him, Mom. I know how it sounds, but it was definitely Jake." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the way he'd looked at her, the familiar cadence of his voice, the scar on his temple that was new but somehow suited him. He knew things that only Jake could know. But why now? Why didn't he contact you sooner if he was alive all this time? Sarah explained as much as she could about the classified mission and the danger Jake had been trying to protect her from, though she kept the details vague. Her parents had never fully understood Jake's work anyway. They'd seen him as a soldier who went to dangerous places for reasons that seemed unnecessarily complicated. "So what are you going to do?" her mother asked when Sarah finished the sanitized version of Jake's story. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I honestly don't know." "Do you still love him?" It was the same question David had asked, the same question Dr. Hayes had danced around, the same question Sarah had been avoiding answering even to herself. But sitting in her kitchen, surrounded by the life she'd built without Jake, Sarah finally let herself feel the truth of it. "Yes," she whispered. "God help me, I do. I tried so hard to move on, to become someone who could love someone else. But seeing him again, it's like the last 3 years just disappeared." "Then what's the problem?" her mother asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "The problem is that I'm not the same person I was when he left. I'm not the girl who was willing to risk everything for love. I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared of letting him back into my life and having him disappear again. I'm scared of giving up the safety I've built here. I'm scared that loving him will destroy me all over again." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, do you remember when you were 7 and you fell off your bike trying to ride without training wheels?" Sarah smiled despite everything. "You made me get right back on. Do you remember what I told you? That courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the right thing anyway." "That's right. And honey, I watched you grieve that boy for 2 years. I watched you fall apart and rebuild yourself from scratch. It was the hardest thing I've ever seen anyone go through." Her mother's voice grew stronger. "But I also watched you survive it. You're not the same girl you were before, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the woman you've become is strong enough to love him better this time." After hanging up with her mother, Sarah sat in the growing darkness of her cottage and tried to imagine what her life might look like with Jake in it. Not the life they'd planned before he left, that innocent dream of marriage and children and growing old together, but something new, built on the foundation of everything they'd both survived. She thought about David, probably grading papers in his neat apartment across town, processing their conversation and trying to figure out how to move forward. She thought about her job at the library, her quiet routines, the small but stable life she'd constructed. It wasn't passionate or exciting, but it was hers, and letting Jake back in meant risking all of it. At 8 o'clock, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I'm at the place where we first talked about forever, if you want to find me." Sarah stared at the message, trying to decode it. She and Jake had talked about forever in dozens of places. Their apartment in Denver, various hotels during his leave, quiet restaurants where they'd planned their future over wine and candlelight. But there was one place that stood out, one conversation that had changed everything between them. The meadow above Glacier National Park, where they'd gone camping during his last leave before the deployment. They'd hiked up to a clearing surrounded by wildflowers and mountains, and Jake had told her he wanted to spend the rest of his life making her happy. She'd said she wanted to grow old with him in a place just like this, somewhere beautiful and peaceful, where they could watch sunsets and raise children who would never doubt they were loved. Sarah grabbed her jacket and keys, then hesitated at the door. Once she drove to that meadow, once she found Jake waiting for her in the place where they'd promised each other forever, there would be no more pretending that her feelings were complicated or unclear. She would have to choose safety or love, the life she'd built or the life she'd lost. The drive to Glacier took 45 minutes on winding mountain roads, and Sarah's hands shook on the steering wheel the entire way. She passed other cars heading back toward town, families returning from dinner, couples on date nights, normal people living normal lives that didn't involve resurrection and classified missions and impossible choices. The trailhead parking lot was empty except for a single pickup truck that Sarah didn't recognize. She parked next to it and sat in her car for several minutes, building up the courage to make the hike to the meadow. The trail was only 2 miles, but it felt like walking toward the edge of the world. Sarah had hiked this trail dozens of times since moving to Montana, drawn back to the place where she and Jake had been happiest. She'd never told anyone about those visits, not even Dr. Hayes. It felt too private, too much like picking at a healing wound. But now, walking the familiar path in the darkness with only her flashlight to guide her, she realized that some part of her had always been hoping Jake would find his way back to this place. The meadow opened before her like a secret garden, bathed in moonlight and surrounded by the dark shapes of mountains against the star-filled sky. Jake was sitting on a fallen log at the far edge of the clearing, and when her flashlight beam found him, he stood and raised his hand in a gesture that was half greeting, half surrender. Sarah walked toward him slowly, taking in the way he looked in this place that had always belonged to both of them. He'd changed out of the military surplus clothing he'd worn at the bridge, and was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look more like the man she remembered. But the wariness was still there, the careful way he held himself that suggested he was ready to run if she told him to. "You came," he said, when she was close enough to hear him without shouting. "I came," Sarah agreed, stopping about 10 feet away, close enough to see his face clearly, far enough to maintain some emotional distance. "How long have you been here?" "Since this afternoon. I wasn't sure you'd remember this place, or what it meant to us." Sarah looked around the meadow, remembering the way it had looked that summer day 3.5 years ago. They'd spread a blanket in the center of the clearing and made love under the afternoon sun, then lay together afterward, talking about the house they would buy when Jake finished his military service. They'd planned everything in perfect detail: the wraparound porch, the garden Sarah would plant, the workshop where Jake would build furniture in his spare time. "I remember," she said quietly. "I've been coming here since I moved to Montana. It felt like the closest I could get to you." Jake's face softened. "Sarah, I need you to know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every day for 3 years, I thought about coming home to you. You were the reason I survived everything they did to me." "But you didn't come home," Sarah said. "You stayed away, even after you escaped. You let me think you were dead while you were out there somewhere, building a new life without me." "Not without you," Jake said urgently. "Everything I did was about getting back to you. The investigation, the evidence gathering, the risk I took coming here. It was all so that someday we could have a life together without looking over our shoulders." Sarah felt tears starting, though she tried to hold them back. "Do you have any idea what it was like, thinking you were dead? Do you know what it did to me?" "I know," Jake said, and his voice broke. "I know, and I'm so sorry. If there had been any other way." "There's always another way." Sarah's composure finally cracked, and 3 years of suppressed anger came flooding out. "You could have found a way to contact me. You could have let me know you were alive, even if you couldn't come home. You could have trusted me to understand, to help, to be part of whatever you were trying to do." "I couldn't risk it," Jake said desperately. "If they'd found out you were alive and that I cared about you, they would have used you to get to me. They would have hurt you to make me cooperate. So instead, you hurt me by disappearing." Sarah was crying now, years of grief and rage finally finding their voice. "You made the decision for both of us, just like you always did. You decided what was best for me without asking what I wanted." Jake stared at her, and she could see that her words had hit home. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I thought I was protecting you, but I was really protecting myself from having to watch them use you against me." The honesty in his admission deflated some of Sarah's anger. This was the Jake she'd fallen in love with, the one who could admit when he was wrong, who could see past his own motivations to the truths underneath. "I became a different person after you died," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "I had to. The girl who loved you so completely that losing you nearly killed her. I couldn't be her anymore. It wasn't safe." "I know," Jake said. "I can see it in the way you hold yourself, the way you keep your distance. You used to run toward things that scared you. Now you run away from them." Sarah nodded, surprised by how accurately he'd read her. "I learned to be careful, to protect myself, to not want things so much that losing them would destroy me." "And now?" Jake asked. "What do you want now?" Sarah looked at him standing in the moonlight, this man who had died and been resurrected, who carried secrets that could get them both killed, who was asking her to risk everything she'd built for the chance at love. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away, to go back to her cottage and her job and the peaceful life she'd constructed. But standing in the meadow where they'd once promised each other forever, Sarah realized that safety had never been what she truly wanted. What she'd wanted was to feel alive, to love someone so completely that their happiness mattered more than her own self-protection. And despite everything that had happened, despite the 3 years of grief and the walls she'd built around her heart, that feeling was still there, waiting for her to be brave enough to acknowledge it. "I want to try," she said finally. "I want to see if we can build something new together, something that doesn't depend on forgetting the last 3 years or pretending we're the same people we were before." Jake's face lit up with hope and relief. "Sarah, but I have conditions," she continued, holding up her hand to stop him from moving closer. "No more secrets. No more making decisions for me. If we're going to do this, we do it as partners, with complete honesty about the risks and the reality of what your situation means for both of us." "Agreed," Jake said immediately. "Anything you want, and we take it slow. I need time to trust you again, to believe that you won't disappear the moment things get complicated." "How slow?" Jake asked, and there was something almost boyish in the question that reminded Sarah of the man she'd fallen in love with. "Slow enough that I don't lose myself in you again," Sarah said. "Fast enough that we don't waste any more time being afraid." Jake smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since his return, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight control she'd maintained over her emotions for 3 years. What comes next is even stronger, and to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free, and you'll be with me in every new story. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now," Jake said, finally closing the distance between them, "we figure out how to fall in love all over again." When he reached for her hand, Sarah let him take it, feeling the familiar calluses on his palms and the way their fingers fit together like pieces of a puzzle she'd thought was lost forever. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Too much had happened, too much had changed, but it was something new, something that belonged to the people they'd become, rather than the people they'd been. Standing together in the meadow under the Montana stars, Sarah felt like she was finally breathing deeply for the first time in 3 years. The future was uncertain, dangerous, full of complications she couldn't even imagine. But for the first time since Jake's supposed death, uncertain felt better than safe. "I love you," Jake said quietly. "I know everything's different now, but that hasn't changed." Sarah looked up at him, seeing both the boy she'd fallen in love with and the man he'd become through suffering she could barely comprehend. "I love you too," she whispered. "I never stopped, even when I tried to." When Jake kissed her, it felt like coming home and starting over all at the same time. 6 months later, Sarah woke to the sound of Jake making coffee in the kitchen of their new cabin, 20 miles outside Whitefish, in a location that didn't appear on any GPS and could only be reached by a dirt road that most people would assume led nowhere important. The cabin had been Jake's idea, remote enough for security, comfortable enough for the life they were trying to build together, with sight lines in all directions and escape routes that Jake had memorized but never discussed in detail. Sarah stretched in their shared bed, still sometimes surprised to find herself here, in this life that felt both familiar and completely new. The morning light filtered through windows that Jake had installed himself, bulletproof glass that looked ordinary but could stop anything short of military-grade ammunition. She'd learned not to ask too many questions about precautions like that, just as she'd learned to accept that some aspects of their life would always be shaped by dangers she couldn't fully understand. "Coffee's ready," Jake called from the kitchen, and Sarah smiled at the domestic normalcy of it. 6 months of taking things slowly had taught them both that rebuilding love was different from building it the first time, more deliberate, more careful, but also deeper in ways that surprised her. Sarah pulled on Jake's old army t-shirt and padded barefoot to the kitchen, where she found him standing at the window with his coffee mug, scanning the tree line with the automatic vigilance that had become second nature. He did this every morning, and Sarah had stopped commenting on it after the first few weeks. Some habits born from survival couldn't be unlearned, only managed. "Anything interesting out there?" she asked, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. "Just the usual. Mrs. Henderson's dog got loose again. I can see him chasing something through the Anderson property." Jake leaned back against her, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," Sarah said, and meant it. The nightmares had taken months to fade. Dreams of losing Jake again, of men in black suits appearing at their door, of waking up to find the last 6 months had been an elaborate fantasy. But slowly, the good dreams had returned. Dreams of the future they were building together, different from the one they'd planned before, but no less precious. Jake turned in her arms and kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become their morning ritual. "I have news," he said, and something in his voice made Sarah's stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "Good news or bad news?" "Good news, I think. The investigation is finally moving to indictment. The prosecutor thinks they have enough evidence to move forward with charges against the Pentagon officials who orchestrated the mission that killed my team." Sarah felt a complex mix of relief and apprehension. For months, Jake had been working with a small group of journalists and federal investigators, carefully building a case against the people who had betrayed his unit. It was dangerous work that required him to travel frequently to meetings in cities where Sarah couldn't accompany him, leaving her alone in the cabin with nothing but encrypted phone calls to assure her that he was safe. "That's good," she said carefully. "That's what we've been working toward." "It is," Jake agreed, "but it also means things are going to get more complicated. Once the indictments are announced, the people we're going after are going to know exactly who provided the evidence against them. They're going to come after us." Sarah had known this moment would come eventually, but hearing it stated so plainly still made her chest tighten with fear. "What does that mean for us?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on her waist. "It means we need to be ready to disappear. New identities, new location, new everything. The life we've been building here, it might not be safe to keep it." Sarah pulled back to look at him, seeing the weight he carried in his eyes. This was the choice he'd been protecting her from 3 years ago. The reality of loving someone whose very existence was a threat to powerful people. But this time, he was letting her be part of the decision instead of making it for her. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Maybe a few weeks, maybe less." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing through what would need to be done. She'd have to quit her job at the library, say goodbye to the few friends she'd made in Montana, leave behind the cottage that had been her sanctuary. It should have felt devastating, but instead, she felt strangely calm. The life she'd built in Whitefish had been about healing and safety. But this life with Jake was about something bigger: justice, truth, the kind of love that was worth risking everything for. "Okay," she said simply. Jake stared at her. "Okay? Okay. We'll do whatever we need to do. We'll go wherever we need to go." Sarah reached up to touch his face, feeling the scar that ran from his temple to his cheek. "I didn't survive 3 years of thinking you were dead, just to lose you now, because I was too scared to take risks." Jake's eyes filled with something that might have been tears. "Sarah, you don't understand what this means. New identities means never seeing your family again, never going home to Nebraska, never having any contact with the people from your old life. It means living every day, knowing that the wrong person recognizing us could get us both killed. I understand, Sarah said, and realized she meant it. I've spent 3 years living a half-life, being safe and careful and emotionally protected. I don't want to be safe anymore, Jake. I want to be alive, and I'm only fully alive when I'm with you. Jake kissed her then, desperate and grateful, and full of the kind of love that made risks feel like adventures instead of threats. When they broke apart, Sarah could see that some fundamental fear in him had finally been laid to rest. The fear that she would choose safety over him, that the woman he'd fallen in love with had been replaced by someone too cautious for the life he could offer. There's something else, Jake said when they'd both caught their breath. The prosecutor wants us to testify. In open court, on the record. It would mean going public with everything. Who we are, what happened, all of it. Sarah felt a chill of genuine fear. Testifying would make them visible in a way that couldn't be undone. Targets for anyone who wanted to prevent their story from being told. But it would also mean that Jake's teammates, the men who had died in that Afghan valley, would finally get justice. What do you think we should do? She asked. I think, Jake said slowly, that I spent 3 years hiding in the shadows, and I'm tired of being invisible. I think those men who died deserve to have their story told, and I think the people who killed them deserve to face consequences. Sarah nodded. She thought about Jake's teammates, men she'd never met but whose photographs Jake kept in a frame on his dresser. Young men who'd believed they were serving their country, who'd died not in combat with enemy forces, but because of betrayal by their own leadership. Then we testify, she said, and whatever happens after that, we face it together. Jake smiled, the kind of smile that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Are you sure? Because once we do this, there's no going back to quiet lives and anonymous existence. I'm sure, Sarah said, surprising herself with how certain she felt. Besides, quiet was never really my style. I just forgot that for a while. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free, and it helps me keep sharing these powerful stories. Over the next 2 weeks, they made their preparations with the methodical efficiency that came from knowing their time was limited. Sarah quit her job at the library, telling Mrs. Patterson that she was moving away to be with family. It wasn't entirely a lie. Jake was her family now, in all the ways that mattered. She packed only the essentials, leaving behind most of the possessions she'd accumulated during her 3 years in Montana. The cottage that had been her sanctuary would go to someone else, though she found herself surprisingly unsentimental about leaving it. It had served its purpose, helping her heal from Jake's loss and discover who she could be on her own. But she was ready now for whatever came next. Jake spent his time in encrypted communication with the prosecution team, reviewing testimony and evidence, preparing for the moment when their story would become part of the public record. He was calmer than Sarah had expected, as if the prospect of finally speaking truth to power was giving him a peace he hadn't felt in years. On their last night in the cabin, they sat on the porch swing Jake had built, looking out at the mountains that had sheltered their love story's second beginning. Sarah wore the engagement ring Jake had carried through 3 years of hell. They'd married quietly the month before, in a ceremony attended only by the federal prosecutor and her deputy, who served as witnesses. Any regrets? Jake asked, his arm around her shoulders. Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about David Chen, who was dating the new art teacher and seemed genuinely happy. She thought about her parents, who'd been shocked but ultimately supportive when she'd explained that she was going into witness protection. She thought about Emma, who'd cried when Sarah called to say goodbye, but who'd also said she was proud of her sister for choosing love over safety. No regrets, Sarah said finally. This feels right. Scary as hell, but right. Even though we don't know what comes next? Sarah looked at her husband, a word that still felt new and wonderful in her mind, and saw the boy who'd read her bedtime stories, and the man who'd survived torture for the chance to come home to her. She saw someone worth risking everything for, someone whose love had taught her that safety was less important than being fully, completely alive. Especially because we don't know what comes next, she said. That's what makes it an adventure. Jake laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent and more carefree as the weight of secrets lifted from his shoulders. I love you, Sarah Harrison. I love you too, Jake Harrison. Sarah settled more comfortably against his side. watching the sun set behind the mountains. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. As they sat in the gathering darkness, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that October night when she'd found Jake's letters on her coffee table. She'd been a different person then, careful, controlled, afraid of wanting too much. Now she was someone who could look at an uncertain future and see possibility instead of threat. The testimony would happen in 3 days in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. After that, they would disappear into new identities and a new life, probably somewhere far from Montana's mountains and familiar comforts. But they would be together, and that was enough, more than enough. Sarah thought about the girl who had burned Jake's letters 3 years ago, trying to destroy the evidence of a love that had nearly killed her. That girl had been wise in her own way, protecting herself the only way she knew how. But she'd also been afraid that love meant vulnerability, that caring deeply meant risking destruction. The woman sitting on this porch swing knew better now. She knew that love didn't make you weak. It made you brave enough to fight for what mattered. It made you strong enough to rebuild when things fell apart. It made you bold enough to bet everything on the chance that some stories get second endings. "Ready for bed?" Jake asked as the first stars appeared overhead. "Ready for whatever comes next," Sarah replied, and meant it completely. As they walked inside together, Sarah caught a glimpse of their reflection in the window. Two people who had found their way back to each other despite impossible odds, who had chosen love over safety and truth over silence. Tomorrow they would begin the process of changing the world, one testimony at a time. Tonight, they would hold each other close and dream of the future they were brave enough to build. In the distance, an owl called through the Montana darkness, and Sarah smiled at the sound. She'd always loved the way night sounds reminded her that the world was bigger than her fears, full of mysteries and possibilities that couldn't be contained by careful planning or emotional walls. She was ready for those mysteries now, ready for the adventure of loving someone completely, consequences and all, ready to be fully alive.